Tonight we begin not in a palace or a temple, but on the surface of a wide grey lake just before dawn, where a man with rough hands is pulling a net out of the water and finding it empty. He does not know that crowds will one day press to touch his shadow. He does not know that an empire will one day fear his name. For now he is only tired, and the fish are not biting, and his brother is complaining beside him. His name is Simon, and he is about to become the most unlikely founder of one of the largest movements in human history. Before we drift into his story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. It helps more than you might guess. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time in the comments below. It helps other sleepless travelers find their way to this quiet corner, and it is always a comfort to know we are awake together across so many time zones. So settle into your pillow now. Let your shoulders go heavy. Let your breathing slow. And let yourself drift gently into the long and strange life of Simon, the fisherman who became St. Peter. The lake he worked was called the Sea of Galilee, though it was really a freshwater lake about 13 miles long, ringed by green hills that turned gold in the late sun. It sat in the north of a small province that the Romans had folded into their enormous empire. The water was famous for sudden storms. Cold air would slide down from the heights and strike the warm surface, and within minutes a calm evening could turn into a wall of waves. Fishermen learned to read the sky the way other men read a face. They knew when to stay home, and they knew when a good night might fill their boats. Simon was one of these men. He was not poor in the way a beggar was poor, but he was not comfortable either. He owned at least one boat, perhaps a share in more, and he worked with a small crew that included his brother Andrew and two other brothers named James and John. Fishing was a partnership business. Men shared nets, shared boats, and shared the risk of a long night that produced nothing. They sold their catch to dealers who salted and dried the fish, and those preserved fish traveled far across the region, even to distant cities. The little lake fed a surprising number of mouths. We should be honest about the work. It was wet, cold, and endless. Nets had to be thrown, hauled, emptied, and then cleaned of weeds and mud before the next throw. They had to be mended constantly, because a single tear let the whole catch slip away. A fisherman spent as much time repairing his gear as using it, and like everyone else, he paid taxes. There were tolls on the roads, duties on goods, and a temple tax once a year. A fisherman could spend half the night working and still feel that half his catch belonged to someone in a fine house he would never meet. Some things about the world do not change as much as we like to imagine. Simon lived in a town called Capernaum on the northern shore. It was a working town of perhaps 1,000 people, built of black basalt stone that came from the old volcanoes nearby. The houses were low and dark, clustered tightly together, sharing courtyards where families cooked over open fires and children played in the dust. The streets were narrow and unpaved. Donkeys carried loads through them, and the smell of fish and smoke hung over everything. It was not a glamorous place, but it sat on a trade road, so travelers passed through, and news from the wider world arrived with them. Simon was married. We know this because the Gospels later mention his mother-in-law, which means there was a wife and a household, and the ordinary weight of providing for people who depended on him. He was probably in his late 20s or early 30s when our story truly begins, an age when a man has stopped dreaming of a different life and has mostly made peace with the one he has. He was, by every sign, an ordinary man. He was quick to speak, quick to act, and quick to regret it. He felt things strongly and showed it on his face. None of this marked him as special. The world was full of warm, loud, hard-working men who would live and die without history ever noticing them. And yet, something was stirring in that province in those years. The land had been ruled by foreign powers for centuries, and the people carried a long memory of kings and prophets and a promise that a deliverer would come. Times were tense, taxes were heavy. Roman soldiers walked the roads. Local rulers played their dangerous games with the empire, trying to keep their thrones by keeping Rome pleased. And out in the wilderness, strange preachers were appearing, men who spoke of repentance and of a kingdom that was near. People walked for days to hear them. Something in the air felt unsettled, as if the whole region were holding its breath. Simon would have heard the talk. His brother Andrew in particular seems to have been drawn to it. While Simon stayed close to his nets and his family, Andrew went looking for answers, and he found his way to one of those wilderness preachers, a fierce man dressed in animal skins who baptized people in the river and warned that someone greater was coming after him. Andrew listened, and when that greater someone finally appeared, Andrew came running back to Capernaum with news that would tear his older brother away from everything he had ever known. For now, though, none of that had happened. For now there was only the lake, the empty net, the grey light, and a tired man deciding whether to throw one more time before going home to sleep. He had no idea that his real life had not yet begun. He had no idea that within a few short years he would stand before crowds, before rulers, before the gates of a strange and distant city, carrying a message he could not yet imagine. Tonight we will follow him there slowly, gently, from this quiet shore all the way to the heart of the Roman world. But we begin here, with the water, the cold, and a man who was about to be found, the world he was born into. To understand the man, we have to understand the world that shaped him, and that world was a small, crowded, anxious place caught between great powers. Simon was born sometime near the very end of the period we now call the years before the Common Era, in a land the Romans called Judea, though the northern region where he lived had its own name, Galilee. The whole territory was about the size of a modest modern county, yet it carried a weight of history far larger than its borders. For hundreds of years this land had passed from one empire to another. The Babylonians had come and taken its people into exile. The Persians had let them return. The Greeks under Alexander the Great had swept through and left their language and customs scattered across the region. Then a local family had won a brief stretch of independence, only for the Romans to arrive and absorb everything into their growing empire. By the time Simon was a boy, Roman power was simply a fact of life, like the weather, something you lived under whether you liked it or not. The Romans did not usually rule such places directly. They preferred to install local kings who would do the heavy work of keeping order while sending taxes and loyalty back to Rome. The most famous of these was a ruler named Herod, often called Herod the Great, a brilliant and brutal builder who covered the land with fortresses, harbors, and a magnificently rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. He was hated and feared in equal measure. When he died, his kingdom was carved up among his sons, and Galilee fell to one of them, a man named Herod Antipas, who ruled throughout most of Simon's adult life. Antipas built a brand new capital city on the shore of the very lake where Simon fished. He named it Tiberias, in honor of the Roman emperor, and he filled it with the comforts of Greek and Roman life. From his boat, Simon could likely see its rooftops in the distance. It was a reminder, always there on the horizon, that the local powers lived in a different world from the men who worked the water. The fisherman and the ruler shared a lake, but little else. This was a deeply layered society, and here, just once in our whole story, it is worth pausing to picture how people actually lived, what they wore, and what they ate, because it tells us so much about the man we are following. At the top sat a thin layer of the very powerful. There were the ruling families, the high priests and their relatives in Jerusalem, and the wealthy landowners. These people wore long robes of fine linen and dyed wool, sometimes trimmed with purple, which was the most expensive color in the ancient world because it came from crushing thousands of tiny sea snails. They reclined at banquets on cushioned couches and ate roasted meats, imported wine, figs, dates, almonds, and delicacies brought from across the empire. They lived in stone houses with courtyards, mosaics, and private baths. Below them was a middling layer of artisans, merchants, and skilled workers, and this is roughly where Simon and his fishing partners belonged. They were not destitute, but every coin mattered. They wore simple tunics of undyed wool or rough linen, belted at the waist, with a larger cloak thrown over the top that doubled as a blanket at night. Most went barefoot or wore plain leather sandals. Their meals were humble and repetitive. The daily foundation was bread, dense and dark, baked fresh because there was no way to keep it. Around that bread came olives, olive oil for dipping, salted fish from their own trade, cheese, lentils, onions, and whatever vegetables the season offered. Meat was rare, saved for festivals and celebrations. Wine, watered down, was the common drink, because it was safer than much of the water. At the bottom were the day labourers, the landless, the beggars, and the enslaved, who owned almost nothing and lived from one day's work to the next. They wore whatever they could, ate whatever they could find, and were always one bad harvest away from disaster. It was among these people, the poor and the overlooked, that the message Simon would later carry found its warmest welcome. Religion shaped every hour of this society. The week was ordered around a day of rest. The year was ordered around festivals that drew pilgrims to Jerusalem. The temple was the beating heart of the nation, a vast complex of courts and gates where priests offered sacrifices and where the presence of God was believed to dwell. Ordinary people could not enter its innermost rooms, but they could stand in its outer courts and feel that they stood at the center of the world. To travel up to Jerusalem for a festival was the great event of many lives. Yet underneath the shared faith, the people were divided. Some, called Pharisees, devoted themselves to keeping the ancient law in every small detail, and they were widely respected by ordinary folk. Others, called Sadducees, came mostly from the priestly and wealthy classes and held the real power in the temple. There were also small, intense groups who withdrew into the desert to await the end of the age, convinced that the present world was corrupt beyond saving. And everywhere there was a current of hope and resentment, a longing for a promised deliverer who would throw off Roman rule and restore the nation to glory. This was the air Simon breathed. He was not an educated man. He could probably read and write a little, enough for business, but he had not studied in the great schools, and he spoke with the rough accent of the north, which the sophisticated people of Jerusalem found slightly comical. He was a Galilean, and Galileans had a reputation for being hot-tempered, plain-spoken, and a touch unrefined. None of this troubled him. He had a trade, a family, a town, and a faith, and that was enough to fill a life. But the longing in the land was real, and it pressed on people like Simon more than they might admit. They paid their taxes to a distant emperor, and their tribute to a local ruler, and their tithe to the temple, and at the end of it all they wondered when, if ever, the old promises would come true. They told their children the stories of prophets and kings. They waited, and in the quiet of that waiting, in a backwater province that Rome barely noticed, the events were gathering that would one day reshape Rome itself. Simon stood right in the middle of it, mending his nets, entirely unaware that the world he had been born into was about to crack open along a line that ran straight through his own front door. The stranger who said, "Follow me." It began, as great changes often do, with a younger brother who would not let something go. Andrew had been spending his time with the wilderness preacher down by the river, the fierce man who baptized crowds and spoke of one who was coming. And then, one day, that coming one actually walked past. Andrew watched the teacher from Nazareth move among the people, listened to the few words he spoke, and felt the ground shift under him. He did not wait. He went straight back to Capernaum, found Simon, and told him plainly that he believed they had found the one the whole nation had been waiting for. Simon, we can imagine, was skeptical. He was an older brother, and older brothers are professionally skeptical of younger brothers bringing astonishing news. But Andrew was insistent, and so Simon went to see for himself. The Gospels record that when this teacher first looked at Simon, he did something strange. He gave him a new name on the spot. He said that Simon would be called Cephas, which in the local language meant rock, a name that in Greek became Peter. It was an odd thing to say to a man you had just met, and Simon could not yet have understood it. But the name stuck, and from that moment the fisherman began, slowly, to become someone else. The teacher's name was Jesus. He came from Nazareth, a small and unremarkable town in the same region of Galilee, a place so minor that people joked nothing good could come out of it. He had grown up in a craftsman's household, working with wood and stone, and he had lived quietly until he was about 30 years old. Then he had gone to the river, been baptized by the wilderness preacher, spent time alone in the desert, and emerged speaking with an authority that unsettled everyone who heard him. He did not quote other teachers the way the scholars did. He spoke as if he had the right to speak for himself, and people did not know what to make of it. For a while, Simon seems to have kept one foot in his old life. He had met this remarkable man. He had received a strange new name, but he still had nets to throw and a family to feed. Then came the morning that ended his hesitation. Jesus was walking along the shore of the lake, with a crowd pressing in around him to hear what he was saying. Simon and his partners were nearby, finishing a long and fruitless night, washing their nets after catching nothing at all. Jesus stepped into Simon's boat and asked him to push out a little way from the shore, so that he could sit and teach the crowd from the water where his voice would carry. Simon, perhaps too tired to argue, did as he was asked. When the teaching was finished, Jesus told Simon to row out into the deeper water and let down the nets for a catch. Simon objected, and his objection is one of the most human lines in the whole account. He pointed out that they had worked all night and caught nothing, that he was an experienced fisherman and this stranger was a carpenter, and that there was simply no fish to be had. And then, almost grudgingly, he added that he would do it anyway because the teacher said so. It is the sound of a practical man deciding to humor someone he is beginning, against his better judgment, to trust. What happened next, according to the account, was that the nets filled so suddenly and so heavily that they began to tear, and Simon had to signal his partners in the other boat to come and help. Both boats were filled until they nearly sank under the weight. Simon was overwhelmed. He fell down before Jesus and told him to go away, because he was a sinful man and could not bear to be near him. It was not a calculated response. It was the raw reaction of someone who has glimpsed something far larger than himself and feels suddenly small and exposed. Jesus told him not to be afraid, and then he said the words that changed everything. From now on, he told Simon, "You will catch men." It was a fisherman's promise to a fisherman, simple and direct, and Simon understood it. When the boats reached the shore, Simon and Andrew, along with James and John, left the greatest catch of their lives lying on the beach, walked away from their boats and their nets and their trade, and followed the teacher up the road. They left behind security, income, and the only work they had ever known. They followed a man they had known for only a short time, toward a future none of them could describe. It is worth sitting with how reckless this was. These were not idle young men with nothing to lose. Simon had a wife and a household. He had partners who depended on him, and a business that had just proven, that very morning, that it could be wildly profitable. To walk away from all of it required a kind of conviction that is difficult to explain from the outside. The accounts do not pretend it was a careful decision. They present it as something closer to a magnetic pull, a sense that this was the thing one's whole life had been quietly waiting for. From that point forward, Simon Peter was no longer primarily a fisherman. He was a follower, a student, one of a growing group of men and women who traveled with the teacher from town to town, listening, watching, and trying to understand. His home in Capernaum became a kind of base. The Gospels describe Jesus staying there, and they record that early on he healed Simon's mother-in-law of a fever in that very house, after which she got up and served the household, which is a small, ordinary, deeply believable detail in the middle of an extraordinary story. Word spread quickly. People came to the house in Capernaum in such numbers that they crowded the door. They brought the sick and the troubled. They came at all hours. Simon's quiet working life dissolved into something loud, demanding, and constant. He had wanted perhaps a good catch and a peaceful evening. Instead, he had found himself at the center of a gathering storm of attention, standing beside a man whom some called a healer, some called a prophet, and some were already beginning to call dangerous. He had said yes to a stranger on a beach. He would spend the rest of his life discovering exactly what he had agreed to, inside the circle of 12. The group that formed around Jesus was larger and looser than people often imagine. Crowds followed him everywhere. Many men and women supported him, traveled with him for stretches, and believed in him. But out of this wider following, Jesus chose a smaller, fixed group of 12 men to be his closest companions, the ones who would be with him constantly and learn from him most directly. Simon Peter was one of them, and from the start he stood out as a leader among them, though not always for flattering reasons. The 12 were a strange and mismatched set of people. There were the 4 fishermen from the lake, Simon Peter, his brother Andrew, and the 2 brothers James and John, who were so loud and forceful that Jesus nicknamed them the Sons of Thunder. There was a tax collector named Matthew, a man whose former profession would have made him an outcast among ordinary people, since tax collectors worked for the foreign power and were widely despised as cheats and traitors. There was a man called Simon the Zealot, whose name suggests he had once belonged to the fiercely nationalist movement that wanted to drive out the Romans by force. To put a former tax collector and a former revolutionary in the same small group was, in its way, a quiet provocation. These were men who in normal life would have hated each other. There were others whose names we know but whose personalities barely survive in the record. Ordinary men pulled from ordinary lives. And there was one, Judas, who kept the group's common purse and whose name has come down through history attached to the act of betrayal that would later tear the group apart. But all of that lay in the future. In these early days, the 12 were simply learning, walking the dusty roads of Galilee, sleeping rough, eating what was offered, and trying to understand the man they had chosen to follow. Peter's role among them was peculiar. He was not the wisest, and he was certainly not the calmest. What he had was a kind of forward energy. When a question was asked of the group, Peter was usually the one who answered, sometimes brilliantly and sometimes foolishly. When something needed to be said, Peter said it, often before he had finished thinking it through. The Gospels seem almost fond of this trait. They record again and again how Peter spoke up, leapt forward, made promises he could not keep, and asked the questions everyone else was too cautious to ask. He was the one who tested everything, the one who could not stay quiet, the one whose mistakes became lessons for the rest. This made him the natural spokesman of the group, and it placed him, along with James and John, in an inner circle within the inner circle. On several occasions, the accounts describe Jesus taking only those 3 with him, leaving the other 9 behind. They were present at moments the others did not witness. Whatever it was that Jesus saw in Peter, it was not polish or learning. It seems to have been a raw capacity to be transformed, a heart large enough to hold both great failure and great change. The life they led was hard and irregular. They had no fixed home now. They moved through the towns and villages of Galilee gathering crowds, and the demands never stopped. People wanted healing, wanted answers, wanted to argue, wanted to follow. There was rarely time to rest. The accounts describe Jesus and his companions retreating to quiet places to escape the press of people, only to find the crowds had run ahead and were waiting for them. For a former fisherman used to the solitude of a dark lake, the sheer human density of this new life must have been exhausting, and the teaching itself was unsettling. Jesus told stories called parables that turned ordinary expectations upside down. He praised the poor and warned the rich. He welcomed the people that respectable society pushed away, the tax collectors, the beggars, the women of bad reputation, the sick whom others feared to touch. He touched people that no one else would touch. He forgave things that others said could not be forgiven. To follow him was to have one's assumptions about the world steadily dismantled, day after day. Peter, who had grown up inside the ordinary categories of his society, found those categories dissolving around him. There were also the moments that defied ordinary explanation. The accounts are full of healings, of people who could not walk getting up, of the blind seeing, of fevers breaking and minds clearing. Whatever a modern reader makes of these reports, what matters for our story is that the people who witnessed them, including Peter, were convinced they were seeing something genuinely beyond the natural order. These were not credulous fools eager to be deceived. They were hard-headed working people, fishermen and laborers, and they came away changed. Peter built the rest of his life on what he believed he saw in those years. Opposition grew alongside the crowds. The religious authorities watched Jesus with rising alarm. He healed on the day of rest, which they considered a violation of the law. He forgave sins, which they considered a thing only God could do. He spoke of the temple and the traditions with a freedom that struck them as dangerous. Scholars came up from Jerusalem to investigate him and to argue with him in public, and the arguments grew sharper. The 12 found themselves caught in the middle, defenders of a man who seemed determined to provoke the most powerful people in the land. Through it all, Peter kept following. He did not always understand. The accounts show him confused, frightened, and occasionally rebuked. But he did not leave. There is a moment recorded later when many of the wider followers drifted away because the teaching had grown too hard, and Jesus turned to the 12 and asked whether they too wanted to go. It was Peter who answered, and his answer has the ring of a man who has thought about leaving and found he cannot. He said simply that there was nowhere else to go, because he was convinced this teacher held the words of life. It was not certainty. It was something more durable than certainty. It was loyalty to a person he could not fully explain but could no longer leave. That loyalty would soon be tested in ways Peter could not imagine. The man called Rock. There came a day, somewhere in the middle of these traveling years, that Peter would remember for the rest of his life, because it was the day the strange new name he had been given finally began to mean something. The group had walked north, to the edges of the territory they normally moved through, to a region near a town called Caesarea Philippi. It was a place with a different feel, full of shrines to foreign gods, with a great rock face and a spring gushing from a cave, a setting heavy with old pagan worship. It was here, in this unlikely spot, that Jesus turned to his companions and asked them a question that had been hanging unspoken in the air for a long time. He asked them first who the crowds thought he was. The answers came easily, because the group had heard the rumors in every town. Some people said he was the wilderness preacher come back to life. Some said he was one of the great prophets of old returned. Some said he was a prophet of a new kind. The companions reported all of this, the gossip of the roads, the various guesses people made when they could not fit Jesus into any familiar category. It was safe ground. They were only repeating what others said. Then Jesus narrowed the question and made it personal. He asked them directly who they themselves believed he was. And here the group fell quiet, because this was a different kind of question, one that could not be answered with second-hand rumor. To answer it was to commit. It was Peter, of course, who spoke. He said that he believed Jesus was the long-awaited deliverer, the chosen one of God, the figure the whole nation had been waiting for across the centuries. It was the boldest thing anyone in the group had yet said out loud, and Peter said it plainly, the way he said most things. Jesus responded with words that would echo through 2,000 years of history. He told Peter that he was blessed, that this insight had not come to him through ordinary human reasoning, but had been revealed to him. And then he played on the name he had given Peter at their very first meeting. He said that Peter was the rock, and that upon this rock he would build his community, and that the powers of death would not overcome it. He spoke of giving Peter keys, an image of authority and responsibility, the keys of a steward who is trusted to manage a great household. It is hard to overstate how much weight has been placed on that single exchange. For many Christians across the centuries, Those words became the foundation of Peter's special role, the basis for the belief that he held a unique authority among the followers, an authority later thought to pass down through the bishops of Rome. Whole institutions, whole arguments, whole histories grew from that moment by the rock and the spring. Other Christians have read the words differently, placing the emphasis less on the man and more on his confession of faith. The interpretation became one of the great dividing lines of later Christian history. But on that day, in that place, it was simply a stunning thing to say to a fisherman from Capernaum. We should not imagine that Peter walked away transformed into a serene and confident leader. The very same conversation, only moments later, produced one of his worst stumbles. Having praised Peter, Jesus went on to tell the group something they did not want to hear. He told them that he would suffer, that he would be rejected by the authorities, that he would be killed, and that he would rise again. The companions could not absorb this. It contradicted everything they hoped the deliverer would be. They expected a triumphant figure who would restore the nation, not a man who spoke calmly of his own death. Peter, true to form, could not keep silent. He took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him, to tell him that this must never happen, that he was wrong to speak this way. It was an astonishing thing to do, to correct the very person he had just declared to be the chosen one of God, and the reply he received was just as sharp. Jesus turned and rebuked Peter in the harshest terms he ever used toward him, telling him that he was thinking in human terms rather than divine ones, that in this moment he had become an obstacle rather than a foundation. The same man who had just been called the Rock was, within minutes, called a stumbling block. There is something almost reassuring in this whiplash. Peter was not a smooth, faultless saint moving serenely from triumph to triumph. He was a man capable of profound insight and immediate blundering, often in the same breath. He could see further than anyone else in the group one moment and miss the point entirely the next. The accounts do not hide this. They seem, if anything, to preserve it deliberately, as though the whole point were that the foundation of this new movement would not be a perfect man but a flawed one who kept getting up. Not long after this, the inner circle witnessed something stranger still. Jesus took Peter, James, and John up a high mountain, away from the others, and there, according to the account, his appearance changed before their eyes, shining with a brightness that terrified them. Peter, overwhelmed and not knowing what to say, blurted out an offer to build shelters on the mountain so they could all stay there. It was a clumsy, well-meaning, entirely Peter sort of thing to say in the face of something he could not comprehend. He wanted to hold the moment, to make it permanent, to do something useful with his hands when his mind had failed. Then the vision passed, and they came back down the mountain into the ordinary world where the crowds and the conflicts were waiting. The name Rock was settling onto Peter now, but it had not yet hardened into anything reliable. He carried it the way a young soldier carries a rank he has not yet earned, aware of the weight, unsure he can bear it. The real test of whether he was a rock or merely a man who had been called one was still ahead, and when it came it would not be on a shining mountain or by a sacred spring. It would come in a dark courtyard, on the worst night of his life, where the choice would be simple and terrible, and where the rock would, for a time, crumble into sand. Faith, fear, and sinking water. Among all the stories told about Peter, there is one that captures him more completely than any other, and it happened, fittingly, on the water that had been his whole world. It is the story of a storm at night, a figure on the waves, and a fisherman who tried to do the impossible and very nearly did, before his nerve gave out and the lake nearly swallowed him. It is, in miniature, the entire shape of his life. The setting was familiar to him. The companions were crossing the lake by boat in the dark. The wind had turned against them, and the waves were rising. Peter knew this lake. He had spent his life on it. He knew exactly how dangerous a night like this could be, how quickly a hard wind could turn a routine crossing into a fight for survival. The men strained at the oars, making little progress, soaked and cold, watching the water build around them. There was nothing unusual about the fear. It was the ordinary, rational fear of experienced men who knew the lake could kill them. What was not ordinary was what they saw next. Out across the black water, a figure was approaching, walking on the surface of the waves as though it were solid ground. The men were terrified, convinced they were seeing a ghost, which under the circumstances is a thoroughly understandable conclusion. Then the figure spoke, and it was the voice of Jesus, telling them not to be afraid. And here, Peter did something that no one else in the boat thought to do. He called out that if it really was Jesus, he should be commanded to come out onto the water himself. It was a wild, characteristic thing to say. The other 11 men sat frozen in the boat, gripping the sides, and Peter alone wanted to climb out into the storm and walk on the sea. Jesus told him to come, and Peter astonishingly did. He climbed over the side of the boat into the middle of a storm and put his feet onto the heaving water, and for a few impossible steps, the account says, he walked. A fisherman who had spent his life on top of this lake in a boat was now standing on top of it without one, moving toward the figure ahead. And then he made the mistake that defines him. He looked away from the figure he was walking toward, and he looked at the wind and the waves around him, and the fear that he had momentarily overcome came flooding back. The instant he remembered to be afraid, he began to sink. The water closed around his legs, and the practical knowledge of a lifetime told him exactly what was about to happen. He cried out for help. Jesus reached out and caught him, and asked him gently why his faith had failed, why he had doubted. Then they climbed together into the boat, and the wind died down. It would be easy to read this story as a simple failure, but that misses what is remarkable about it. 11 men stayed in the boat. Only one climbed out. Peter failed, yes, but he failed at something no one else even attempted. His sinking is famous, but it is worth remembering that before he sank, he walked. This was the pattern of his whole character. He reached further than anyone else, which meant he also fell further than anyone else. He was not cautious enough to avoid the dramatic failures, and he was not timid enough to stay safely in the boat. He was the man who tried. This same quality showed up again and again in smaller ways throughout the traveling years. When Jesus washed the feet of his companions in an act of humble service that embarrassed them all, it was Peter who first refused, insisting that his master should never stoop to wash his feet, and then, when told that he must accept it, swung instantly to the opposite extreme and demanded to be washed all over. He never did anything by halves. He resisted completely, or he committed completely. There was very little middle ground in him. The accounts seem to treasure this about him precisely because it is so recognizable. Most people are not heroic, and most people are not cowardly. Most people are like Peter, capable of both within the same hour, generous and selfish, brave and frightened, brilliant and slow, all bundled together in one confusing person. The decision to build a movement on a man like this, rather than on someone serene and faultless, has struck many readers across the centuries as a deliberate point. The foundation was not chosen for being unbreakable. It was chosen, it seems, for being able to break and mend. Peter watched and absorbed an enormous amount during these years. He saw thousands of people fed from a few loaves and fishes, according to the accounts, and he saw the sick made well and the grieving comforted. He heard the parables again and again, until their strange logic began to seep into him. He argued, he questioned, he got things wrong, and slowly, unevenly, he was being shaped into something he could not yet see. The fisherman's instincts never left him. He remained blunt, physical, quick to react. But layered over that older self, a new self was forming, one that could speak to crowds, lead frightened men, and one day stand without flinching before the powers that would try to silence him. The training, if we can call it that, was nearly complete. The traveling years were drawing toward their end. The conflict with the authorities in Jerusalem had grown too sharp to be contained, and Jesus had begun to speak more and more openly about a final journey to the city. a journey from which, he kept saying, he would not return in the way his companions hoped. Peter heard these warnings and could not accept them. He had walked on water and sunk. He had been called a rock and a stumbling block. He had given up everything to follow this man. And now he was about to follow him into the one place where all of it would be put to the ultimate test, a city that killed prophets during the most crowded and dangerous festival of the year, the confession at Caesarea. We have already glimpsed the moment by the great rock at Caesarea Philippi, when Peter named Jesus as the chosen one and was called the rock in return. But that moment deserves a closer look, because it marks the hinge of the whole story, the point where everything turns from the open roads of Galilee toward the closed trap of Jerusalem. After that confession, the mood of the journey changed. The teaching grew more urgent and more difficult. The destination became fixed. And Peter, having reached the height of his understanding, was about to enter the months that would test whether he understood anything at all. To grasp why the confession mattered so much, we have to remember what the word he used actually carried. The deliverer that the nation awaited was wrapped in centuries of longing and politics. Most people who used the term pictured a triumphant figure, a descendant of the ancient kings who would gather the people, drive out the Romans, and restore the kingdom to its former glory. It was a political hope as much as a religious one. When Peter named Jesus as that figure, he was almost certainly carrying some of that expectation himself. He thought he was joining a movement that would end in victory, in thrones, in the overthrow of the foreign power that taxed his fish and patrolled his roads. This is why the teaching that followed the confession was so devastating to him. Jesus immediately began to redefine the very word Peter had just used. He spoke not of thrones, but of suffering, not of victory, but of rejection and death. He took the great national hope and turned it inside out, and Peter could not follow him there. The rebuke that Peter received, being called a stumbling block, was not really about insolence. It was about a fundamental clash of expectations. Peter wanted a deliverer who would win. Jesus was describing a deliverer who would lose and would somehow win through losing in a way that no one in the group could yet comprehend. From this point on, Jesus began to teach the companions a series of lessons that ran completely against their instincts. He told them that whoever wanted to be first must be last, that whoever wanted to be great must become a servant, that the path ahead led downward into humility and even death before it led anywhere else. He told them to take up their own crosses, using the image of the most shameful and painful death the Romans inflicted, the death reserved for slaves and rebels. To a group expecting glory, this was almost unbearable. They kept arguing among themselves about who would be the greatest in the coming kingdom, and Jesus kept gently overturning the question. The journey toward Jerusalem became a long, slow education in a kind of greatness none of them had ever imagined. They passed through towns and villages, and the crowd still came, but a shadow now lay over everything. The authorities in the capital were openly hostile. There was real danger in going to Jerusalem at all, and the companions knew it. At one point, when Jesus announced he would go to the city, one of the group said grimly that they might as well go and die with him. It was a dark joke, but it was also an accurate reading of the situation. They were walking, knowingly, toward a confrontation that could destroy them all. Peter occupied a strange position in these final months. He had been singled out, named the rock, given the keys, set apart even within the inner circle. And yet he was also the one most likely to misread the moment, most likely to resist the hard truth, most likely to promise more than he could deliver. He carried a special role and a special blindness at the same time. He believed in Jesus more fiercely than perhaps anyone, and he understood what Jesus was actually doing less well than he thought. This combination, fierce loyalty plus deep misunderstanding, would set him up for the catastrophe that was coming. The cultural backdrop pressed in on all of this. Jerusalem at festival time was a city under enormous strain. Pilgrims poured in from across the region and beyond, swelling the population many times over. The Romans, always nervous about unrest, reinforced their garrison and watched the crowds for any sign of trouble. The local authorities walked a tightrope, desperate to keep the peace and keep their positions, terrified that any disturbance might bring down the full weight of Roman power. Into this tense, overcrowded, heavily policed city, a popular teacher with a reputation for challenging the authorities was about to arrive at the head of an excited crowd. It was a situation that could only end one way. Peter walked into it beside his teacher, still hoping, against all the warnings, for a different outcome. He had heard the predictions of suffering and death 3 separate times now, and 3 separate times he had failed to accept them. He had built his hopes on a victory that was not coming, at least not in the form he expected, and he had made, somewhere along the way, a private promise to himself and to his master that whatever happened, he would not abandon him. He believed that promise completely. He was a man who reached further than anyone, after all, and now he reached for a loyalty greater than his own strength could hold. The final week was about to begin. The great festival was approaching, the city was filling, and the small band from Galilee, led by a teacher who kept speaking of his own death and a fisherman who refused to hear it, climbed the last road up toward Jerusalem, toward an upper room, a garden in the dark, a courtyard with a fire, and a sound that Peter would never again be able to hear without remembering the worst thing he ever did. The rock had reached its highest point. Now it would be dropped, and everyone, including Peter himself, would learn what it was truly made of. The last evening together, the final week in Jerusalem moved quickly, and it carried the small band from triumph into terror in the space of a few days. They had entered the city at the start of the festival to the cheers of crowds who spread cloaks and branches on the road, treating Jesus like the deliverer they hoped he was. For a few hours it must have seemed to Peter that the victory he longed for was actually arriving, but the cheering crowds and the rising danger were 2 sides of the same coin. The more the people celebrated, the more the authorities feared, and the more determined they became to remove this troublesome teacher before the festival turned into a riot. The days that followed were tense and confrontational. Jesus taught in the temple courts, sparred openly with the scholars and the priests, and at one point drove out the merchants and money changers who did business in the temple precincts, overturning their tables in a public act of fury that sealed his fate. The authorities now wanted him dead, but they were afraid to seize him in daylight, surrounded by crowds who admired him. They needed to take him quietly, away from the people, and for that they needed someone on the inside. They found that someone in Judas, the keeper of the common purse, who agreed to hand his master over for a sum of money. Peter knew none of this as the festival meal approached. On the evening that the companions gathered to share the traditional supper in a borrowed upper room in the city, he believed he was simply observing the great feast with the man he loved and the friends he had traveled with for years. The meal was heavy with old meaning, a remembrance of an ancient deliverance, of a night long before when the people had been freed from slavery. To share this particular meal together was an act of deep significance. They reclined around the table in the lamplight, in a room above the noise of the crowded city, and for a little while there was something like peace. But Jesus used the meal to say things that broke the peace apart. He took the bread and the wine and gave them a new and startling meaning, speaking of his body and his blood, of a new covenant, of a sacrifice that was about to be made. He spoke again, more plainly than ever, of his coming death. And then he said something that landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. He told them that one of those present, one of the 12 sharing this very meal, would betray him. The companions were stunned. They looked at one another, and each of them, the accounts say, began to ask whether it might be himself, which is a remarkable detail, because it means not one of them was entirely sure of his own loyalty under pressure. In the middle of this heavy evening, Jesus turned to Peter directly and warned him of something specific and terrible. He told Peter that before the night was over, before the rooster crowed at dawn, Peter would deny even knowing him, not once, but 3 times. It was a precise and humiliating prediction, and Peter rejected it with his whole heart. He insisted loudly that he would never do such a thing. He swore that even if every other man abandoned Jesus, he would not. He declared that he was ready to go to prison and to death rather than deny his master. He meant every word. There was no calculation in it. He simply could not imagine himself failing because he loved fiercely and trusted his own strength completely. This is the heart of Peter's tragedy, and it is a very ordinary, very human tragedy. He did not lack love. He did not lack courage in the abstract. What he lacked was self-knowledge. He did not understand the limits of his own nerve because he had never yet been pushed all the way to them. He had walked on water until he looked down. He had been brave until he was truly afraid. And now he was making a promise that depended entirely on a strength he had never had to test under the worst possible conditions. Jesus, who seems to have understood Peter far better than Peter understood himself, did not argue. He simply told him what would happen and added, gently, that when Peter had turned back from his failure, he should strengthen the others. Even in the warning, there was already forgiveness folded inside it, an assumption that Peter would fall and then recover. After the meal, the group left the upper room and walked out of the city in the dark to a quiet grove of olive trees on a hillside, a place called Gethsemane, where they had often gathered. The festival moon was bright over the city behind them. Jesus was visibly troubled now, weighed down by what he knew was coming. He asked Peter, James, and John, the same inner three who had seen the mountain and the bright vision, to stay close and keep watch with him while he prayed. It was a simple request, made by a frightened friend on the worst night of his life. Stay awake with me. Keep me company in the dark. And Peter, who had sworn only hours before that he would go to death for this man, could not even manage to stay awake. 3 times Jesus went off a little way to pray, in real anguish, and 3 times he came back to find Peter and the others asleep. He woke them, gently the first time, more sharply the next, asking whether they could not keep watch even for a single hour. They were exhausted, and the wine and the late hour and the emotional weight of the evening had drained them. But there is something quietly heartbreaking in the picture. The man who would later be the rock of a worldwide movement could not, on this one night, keep his eyes open for his friend. The grand promises of the supper had already begun to crumble in the smallest, most human way, with simple sleep, before any soldier had arrived, and the soldiers were coming. Torches were already moving up the hillside through the trees, led by a familiar figure, and the worst hours of Peter's life were about to begin. 3 times before the rooster, the torches reached the garden, and with them came a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent by the authorities to make the arrest they had been afraid to make in daylight. At their head walked Judas, who had agreed to identify his master with a sign, a kiss of greeting, so that the soldiers would seize the right man in the confusion of the dark grove. The companions, jolted awake into chaos, did not know what to do. And here Peter, true to everything we know about him, reacted before he thought. He drew a sword and swung it, striking one of the men in the crowd and cutting off his ear. It was a hopeless, desperate act. One frightened man with a short blade against an armed crowd, and it could have gotten them all killed. Jesus stopped him at once. He told Peter to put the sword away, said that those who lived by the sword would die by it, and according to one account, reached out and healed the wounded man on the spot. It was the last lesson Peter would receive before everything fell apart. The deliverer he had hoped would lead an army was instead surrendering without a fight, healing the very people who had come to arrest him. Peter's whole picture of how this was supposed to go shattered in that moment. He had drawn a sword for a king who did not want to be defended. The soldiers seized Jesus and led him away, and the companions scattered into the night. This was the moment all the brave promises met reality, and reality won. The men who had sworn to stand by their master ran. Peter ran too, but he did not run all the way. Something in him could not simply flee. He followed the crowd at a distance, hanging back in the shadows, trailing the soldiers as they brought Jesus to the house of the high priest for a hurried nighttime hearing. He wanted to see what would happen. He could not bear to abandon his master completely, even now, so he crept into the courtyard of the high priest's house and sat down among the servants and guards who were warming themselves around a fire, and he waited. This is where the worst hours unfolded, and they unfolded with a terrible simplicity. There was no torture, no dramatic interrogation, no soldier with a sword at his throat. There was only a fire, a cold night, and a few ordinary people making small talk. A servant girl, looking at Peter's face in the firelight, said that he had been with the prisoner from Galilee. It was the most casual possible accusation, made by the lowest possible person, a serving girl with no power over him at all. And Peter, the rock, the man who had sworn to go to prison and death, denied it. He said he did not know what she was talking about. The first denial was out of his mouth before he could stop it. A little later, someone else noticed him and said the same thing, that this man was one of the followers. Again, Peter denied it, this time with an oath, swearing that he did not know the man. The accent gave him away. His rough Galilean speech marked him as an outsider, a northerner, exactly the kind of person who would have followed the Galilean teacher. The people around the fire kept pressing. After about an hour, another bystander insisted that Peter must be one of them, because his accent proved he was from Galilee. And now Peter, desperate and afraid, began to curse and swear that he had never known the man at all. It was the third denial, and it was the most violent, the most complete. He did not merely distance himself, he cut the connection entirely, calling down curses to prove he was telling the truth. And in that exact moment, the accounts say, a rooster crowed. Somewhere in the grey beginning of the dawn, a bird did the ordinary thing that birds do at the edge of morning, indifferent to everything happening in the courtyard. And Peter heard it, and the warning from the supper came back to him all at once, the precise prediction he had so confidently rejected. Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. One of the accounts adds a detail that is almost too painful to read. As the rooster crowed, Jesus, being led across the courtyard, turned and looked directly at Peter. There was no speech, no rebuke, only a look exchanged across a crowded yard in the cold dawn between the man who had sworn undying loyalty and the friend he had just denied 3 times. Peter broke. He got up and went out of the courtyard, and he wept bitterly. The accounts use that word bitterly, and it carries the full weight of a man who has just discovered, in the cruelest possible way, exactly who he is. Everything he had believed about his own courage, his own loyalty, his own special strength, had collapsed in the space of a few hours, undone not by torture, but by a serving girl and a few bystanders around a fire. He had reached further than anyone, declared more boldly than anyone, and fallen harder than anyone. The rock had crumbled completely. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of the fact that this story survived at all. The early followers of Jesus could easily have buried it. The most embarrassing failure of their most prominent leader, the man they revered as the rock and the holder of the keys, could quietly have been left out of the records. Instead, it was preserved in all 4 of the accounts of Jesus, told and retold, never softened. The likeliest explanation is the simplest one. Peter himself told it. He seems to have refused to hide his own worst moment, and in refusing to hide it, he made it one of the most human and enduring stories in all of Western history. A serving girl, a fire, a rooster, and a man weeping in the dark. The greatest failures are rarely dramatic. They are usually small and quiet and over before we understand what we have done. There Peter sat in the dawn, outside the courtyard, ruined in his own eyes. He did not yet know that his story was not over. He did not yet know that the very pattern of his life, reaching and falling and somehow rising again, was about to play out one final time, on a scale that would dwarf everything that had come before. For now there was only grief, and a city waking up to a day that would end with his master dead on a cross. The worst was here, but it would not have the last word. A morning on the shore. What followed the arrest was swift and brutal. Jesus was condemned in a series of hurried hearings, handed over to the Roman governor, and sentenced to death by crucifixion, the slow public execution the Romans used to terrify their subjects into obedience. He was beaten, mocked, and nailed to a cross outside the city walls, where he died within hours as a crowd looked on. For the companions who had followed him for years, who had given up their old lives to walk with him, it was the end of everything. Their teacher was dead, their hopes were buried with him, and Peter carried, on top of the grief that all of them shared, the private agony of knowing that the last thing he had done was deny he ever knew the man. We are not told much about how Peter spent the days immediately after the crucifixion, but we can imagine them well enough. The companions hid behind locked doors, frightened that the authorities would come for them next. The movement seemed finished. Whatever they had believed was now contradicted by the plain fact of a corpse in a borrowed tomb. For Peter, those days must have been a kind of suffocation, the worst grief of his life tangled together with the worst shame of his life, with no way to undo either. The man he had failed was gone, and there could be no apology now, no chance to make it right. That is the particular cruelty of losing someone you have wronged. The debt can never be paid. Then came the reports that changed everything, and that lie at the very center of the Christian faith. According to the accounts, on the first morning after the rest day, some of the women who had followed Jesus went to the tomb and found it empty. They came back with an astonishing claim that Jesus was alive, that they had seen him. The companions did not believe them at first. The accounts are honest about this skepticism. These were grieving people, not credulous ones, and a dead man returning to life was as impossible to them as it is to anyone. But Peter, hearing the report, got up and ran to the tomb to see for himself, characteristically unable to sit still and wait. He found the burial cloths lying there, and the body gone, and he went away wondering what it could possibly mean. Whatever a person makes of these reports, what is beyond dispute is that the followers of Jesus became convinced, with total certainty, that he had risen from the dead and that they had met him alive. This conviction is the engine of everything that follows in our story. It transformed a scattered, terrified group of failures into a movement that would, within a few centuries, reshape the entire Roman world. Frightened men who had hidden behind locked doors became people who would face prison and execution without flinching. Something happened to them that they could not stop talking about, and they were willing to die rather than deny it. Peter, who had denied his master 3 times to save his own skin, would later refuse to deny him even under threat of death. Something accounts for that change, and the followers themselves had only one explanation for it. For Peter, the most important of these encounters came on familiar ground. Back home in Galilee, on the shore of the lake where the whole story had begun, the accounts describe him returning to fishing, perhaps not knowing what else to do, going out on the water at night with some of the others and, fittingly, catching nothing at all. In the grey light of dawn, a figure on the shore called out to them to cast their net on the other side, and the net came up so full they could not haul it in. It was the same sign that had marked the very first call, years before, on the very same water. Peter understood at once who the figure was. He threw himself into the lake and swam for the shore, leaving the others to bring in the boat, because of course he did. He never waited when he could leap. On the shore, a charcoal fire was burning, and breakfast was cooking, bread and fish, the ordinary food of his ordinary old life. The detail of the charcoal fire is quietly devastating, because the last time Peter had stood by a fire of burning coals was in the high priest's courtyard, denying he knew this man. Now there was another fire, and the man himself was tending it. After they had eaten, Jesus turned to Peter and asked him a question, and then asked it again, and then a third time. He asked whether Peter loved him. 3 times the question came, one for each denial in the courtyard, and 3 times Peter answered that yes, he did love him. By the 3rd time, the accounts say, Peter was hurt that the question kept coming, but the repetition was the entire point. 3 denials by a fire were being answered, deliberately and patiently, by 3 affirmations of love by another fire. And each time Peter answered, Jesus gave him a task. Feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, feed my sheep. The man who had failed most completely was not being cast aside. He was being given responsibility, handed the care of the whole flock that Jesus was leaving behind. It was a full restoration, and more than a restoration. It was a commission. The denial had not disqualified Peter. If anything, it had prepared him, because a leader who has failed badly and been forgiven is gentler with the failures of others than a leader who has never fallen. Peter would now lead a community of imperfect people, and he would lead it as a man who knew exactly what imperfection felt like from the inside. There is one more detail in that morning conversation that points to where the story is going. Jesus told Peter that when he was old, he would stretch out his hands and be led where he did not want to go, a quiet way of indicating the kind of death by which Peter would one day die. Peter, ever curious, immediately asked about the fate of another of the companions, and was gently told to mind his own path rather than worry about someone else's. It was a small, almost comic moment, Peter being Peter to the very end, but underneath it lay a serious promise. Peter would not deny his master again. The next time the test came, and it would come, he would meet it. The fisherman who had crumbled in a courtyard would become a rock at last, not because he had never failed, but because he had failed, been forgiven, and risen. And now he had a flock to feed and a world to face, and the years of his greatest work were about to begin. The day the church began, the risen Jesus, according to the accounts, remained with his followers for a time, and then departed from them, leaving them with a startling instruction. They were to wait in Jerusalem for a power that would come upon them, and then they were to carry his message out into the whole world, beginning in the city and spreading to every nation. It was an enormous charge to give a small group of Galilean villagers, with no money, no political power, and no standing in the eyes of the authorities. They were fishermen and laborers and former outcasts, and they were being told to change the world. They waited, as instructed, gathered together in the city, praying and wondering what would happen next. What happened next, according to the account, took place during another of the great festivals, when Jerusalem was once again packed with pilgrims from across the known world. The followers were gathered together when they experienced something they could only describe in images of wind and fire, a sudden, overwhelming sense that the promised power had arrived and filled them. They poured out into the streets, and they began to speak about Jesus to the crowds, and the pilgrims, who came from many different regions and spoke many different languages, were astonished to hear the message in their own tongues. A crowd gathered, confused and amazed, some genuinely moved, and some assuming the followers had simply been drinking too early in the day. And here Peter stepped forward, and the transformation that had begun on the shore became fully visible. The man who had denied even knowing Jesus to a serving girl now stood up in front of a huge public crowd in the very city where his master had been executed only weeks before, surrounded by the same authorities who had ordered that execution, and he preached. He told the crowd plainly who Jesus was, what had happened to him, and what it meant. He did not soften it. He told them that the man they had crucified had been raised from the dead and was the deliverer they had awaited. It was a breathtakingly bold thing to say in that place, at that time, and it came from the mouth of a man who, a few weeks earlier, had been too frightened to admit he knew the prisoner. The accounts say that thousands of people were convinced by what Peter said that day and joined the movement. Whether we take the numbers precisely or not, something dramatic clearly happened. A new community came into being, gathered around the message Peter and the others were preaching. They shared their possessions, ate together, cared for the poor among them, and grew rapidly. The frightened group that had hidden behind locked doors had become a public movement in the heart of the city, and Peter was its leading voice. The rock had finally become what he had been named. What made the difference? The followers themselves had a single answer: the conviction that Jesus was alive. But it is worth noticing the human shape of the change as well. Peter had been broken by his own failure and then rebuilt by being forgiven, and a person who has been through that particular fire is hard to frighten afterward. He had already faced the worst version of himself in that courtyard and survived it. The threats of the authorities held less power over a man who had already lost everything he thought he was and been given a second life. Failure, fully faced and fully forgiven, can produce a strange and durable kind of courage. Peter had it now. The early community he led was unlike anything in the Roman world. It crossed lines that the surrounding society treated as fixed. Rich and poor ate at the same table. People of different backgrounds called one another brother and sister. The sick and the outcast were welcomed rather than shunned. Women played a far larger role than in most of the surrounding culture. It was, in its quiet way, a small social revolution, and it grew because people found in it something they could not find elsewhere: a community that genuinely cared for its weakest members. In a world where the poor and the sick were largely left to die, this was a powerful and attractive thing. Peter performed acts that the accounts describe as healings, echoing the works of his master. The most famous early one involved a man who had been unable to walk, begging at one of the temple gates. Peter told him he had no silver or gold to give, but offered him something else, and the man got up and walked, and a crowd gathered in amazement. Peter used the attention, as he always did now, to speak about Jesus. The pattern was set. A remarkable act would draw a crowd. Peter would preach, and the community would grow. He had found his voice, and he could not stop using it. This did not please the authorities, and that is putting it gently. The same temple leadership that had engineered the death of Jesus now found themselves dealing with his followers, who were not only refusing to disappear but were actively growing and preaching in the temple itself, blaming the leadership for the execution of the very man they were now proclaiming as risen. It was an intolerable situation for them. They had killed the teacher precisely to end the movement, and instead the movement was louder than ever, led by a fisherman who had once been so easily frightened and was now, somehow, impossible to silence. So they arrested him. Peter and the other leaders were seized, held overnight, and brought before the council, the very body that had condemned Jesus. It was the kind of moment that, a short time before, would have sent Peter fleeing into the night. Instead, he stood before the most powerful men in his nation and told them, to their faces, that he would obey God rather than them, and that he intended to keep preaching about Jesus no matter what they did. The members of the council were astonished. The accounts record that they marveled at the boldness of these uneducated, ordinary men and recognized that they had been with Jesus. The serving girl had once made Peter deny everything. Now the supreme council of his nation could not make him back down. The fisherman had become the rock, and the rock would not move. Miracles, prisons, and power. The young community in Jerusalem grew through a period of remarkable energy and serious danger, and Peter stood at the center of both. The authorities, having failed to silence the leaders with a warning, escalated their efforts. The leaders were arrested again, and this time they were flogged before being released, a brutal punishment meant to break their resolve. It did not work. The accounts described them leaving the place of their flogging, actually rejoicing that they had been considered worthy to suffer for the name they preached, which tells us how completely the frightened men of the courtyard had been transformed. They went straight back to teaching, as though the beating had been an encouragement rather than a deterrent. This stubbornness in the face of suffering became a defining trait of the movement, and it baffled the authorities, who were used to threats and punishment producing obedience. There was a moment when one of the most respected scholars on the council, a wise and cautious man, advised his colleagues to leave the movement alone. He pointed out that other popular leaders had risen before, gathered followers, and then come to nothing after their deaths. If this movement was merely human, he argued, it would collapse on its own like the others. But if it somehow came from God, then fighting it would be futile and even dangerous. It was sober, sensible advice, and for a while it held. The authorities, uncertain, eased their pressure. During these years, Peter traveled beyond Jerusalem, carrying the message into the surrounding towns and regions. The community was spreading outward, and Peter moved among the scattered groups of believers, encouraging them, teaching them, and according to the accounts, performing healings along the way. In one town, he was said to have healed a man who had been bedridden for years. In another, he was summoned to the deathbed of a beloved woman known for her kindness to the poor, a maker of garments for widows, and the accounts describe him restoring her to life, an event that brought many in that town into the movement. Wherever he went, the same pattern followed: acts that astonished people, crowds that gathered, and a steadily growing community. It was during this traveling period that Peter experienced what may have been the most personally challenging episode of his leadership, and it had nothing to do with the authorities. It had to do with the question of who exactly this movement was for. Up to this point, the followers of Jesus had been overwhelmingly drawn from a single people, with their own ancient law, their own customs about food and worship, and a deep sense of separation from the surrounding nations. The idea that the message might be meant equally for outsiders, for the very foreigners and Romans whom they had been raised to keep at a careful distance, was not obvious to them at all. It would have seemed, to many, like a betrayal of everything that made them who they were. Peter himself had to be pushed into seeing it. According to the account, he received a strange and vivid vision while waiting for a meal, a vision that overturned the deep rules about clean and unclean food that had governed his entire life, and that he understood to mean he should no longer regard any person as unclean or beyond reach. Shortly afterward, messengers arrived from a Roman officer, a commander of soldiers, asking Peter to come and speak to him. For a man raised to keep his distance from the occupying power, to enter the house of a Roman military officer and share his table was a genuinely shocking step, but Peter went. He stood in the home of a Roman soldier, the kind of man who embodied the foreign power that taxed his fish and patrolled his roads, and he told him about Jesus. And the same transforming power that had come upon the followers in Jerusalem came upon this Roman household too. It is difficult to overstate how important this moment was. It opened the movement in principle to the entire human race rather than to a single people. It was the first crack in a wall that had stood for centuries, the beginning of a community that would eventually cross every border in the empire. And it was Peter, the conservative fisherman from a small town, the least cosmopolitan man imaginable, who took that first step, reluctantly, only because he became convinced it was required of him. He did not invent the idea, he was dragged toward it, but he had the honesty to follow where he believed he was being led, even when it overturned the assumptions of his whole life. When Peter returned to Jerusalem and reported what he had done, the other leaders were alarmed. They criticized him for entering the house of an outsider and eating with him. Peter simply told them the whole story, step by step, and explained that he could not refuse to welcome people whom he believed God had already welcomed. After hearing him out, the others fell silent, and then accepted it. It was a turning point, though its full consequences would take years and serious conflict to work out. The movement had begun, hesitantly, to become something larger than the people who started it. The relative peace did not last. A new ruler, a grandson of the old King Herod, decided to win favor with the authorities by persecuting the leaders of the movement directly. He had one of the prominent leaders, one of the original Inner Three, put to death by the sword, the first of the 12 to be killed. Seeing that this pleased the authorities, he then arrested Peter as well, intending to execute him after the festival. Peter was thrown into prison, chained between two soldiers, with guards posted at the door. It looked like the end. The community gathered and prayed through the night, while their leader sat in a cell awaiting death. According to the account, Peter was sleeping soundly in his chains that night, which is itself a remarkable detail about a man who had once been unable to stay awake for his friend and now slept peacefully on the eve of his own scheduled execution. He had clearly made some kind of deep peace with death. That night, the account says, he was woken by a figure, his chains fell away, and he walked out past the sleeping guards and the iron gate, which opened before him, and found himself free in the street, hardly believing it was real. He made his way to the house where the community was praying, and the servant who answered the door was so overjoyed to hear his voice that she ran back inside to tell everyone without actually opening the door, leaving Peter standing outside knocking while they argued about whether it could possibly be him. It is a small comic scene in the middle of a deadly serious story, and the accounts preserve it with obvious affection. Peter had escaped again, but the noose was tightening, and he would not be able to stay in Jerusalem forever. A quarrel and a council. As the movement spread, it ran into a problem that no amount of courage could simply overcome. A problem of identity that struck at the heart of what the community was becoming. The crack that had opened when Peter entered the Roman officer's house was widening fast. The message was now reaching large numbers of outsiders, people from the surrounding nations with no connection to the ancient law and customs of the founders. These newcomers were joining in great numbers, especially in the cities to the north and west, where a tireless former opponent of the movement, a man named Paul, was traveling from city to city and bringing in crowds of these foreign believers. The question this raised was sharp and practical. Did these newcomers have to take on the entire ancient law, with all its customs and physical requirements and dietary rules, in order to truly belong? Or could they join simply through faith in Jesus, without adopting the inherited identity of the founders? It sounds like a technical religious dispute, but it was really a question about the very nature of the community. Was this a movement within one people, which outsiders could join only by effectively becoming part of that people, or was it something genuinely new and universal, open to everyone on equal terms? The future of the whole enterprise hung on the answer. The disagreement grew so serious that the leaders convened a meeting in Jerusalem to settle it, a gathering that later generations would remember as the first great council of the church. The leading figures came together to argue the matter out. There were those who insisted firmly that the newcomers must take on the full law. There were others, Paul foremost among them, who argued just as firmly that to require this would be to misunderstand the entire message. And there was Peter, whose voice carried great weight because of his standing and because he had been the first to bring an outsider household into the movement years before. Peter stood up and reminded the gathering of his own experience, of how he had been led to the Roman officer's house and seen the same transformation come upon those outsiders as had come upon the founders themselves. He argued that to pile the full weight of the old law onto the newcomers would be to place on them a burden that even the founders had never been able to carry perfectly. He came down, in the end, on the side of openness. The decision the council reached was a compromise, asking the newcomers to observe only a few basic practices while freeing them from the full inherited law. It was a quiet, administrative sort of moment, men arguing in a room and reaching an agreement, and yet it shaped the entire future of one of the world's great religions. Had the council decided the other way, the movement might have remained a small sect within one people and faded with time. Instead, it was set free to become a faith for the whole world. Peter's role in that decision was significant, but his behavior in this period also shows that he remained, to the end, a deeply human and imperfect man. There is a striking account, written by Paul himself, of a confrontation between the two of them in a city to the north. Peter had been freely eating with the foreign believers, sharing their tables as equals, exactly as his vision and his experience had taught him. But when a group of stricter believers arrived from Jerusalem, Peter grew nervous about their disapproval and pulled back, withdrawing from the shared meals so as not to offend the conservatives. Paul was furious. He confronted Peter publicly, accusing him of hypocrisy, of acting against what he knew to be true out of fear of what others would think. It is a remarkable thing to find preserved in the records, the most prominent leader of the early movement being publicly rebuked for cowardice by a colleague, and the rebuke being written down and kept. It shows us that Peter never fully outgrew the weakness that had undone him in the courtyard, the tendency to bend under social pressure, to fear the disapproval of the people around him. Even as a great leader, even after all he had been through, he could still be swayed by who was watching. He was not a marble statue of a saint. He was a real person, capable of standing fearlessly before the Supreme Council of his nation one year and then quietly shuffling away from a dinner table the next because he was worried about gossip. The two things lived in the same man. We do not know exactly how the confrontation with Paul ended, but the two seem to have remained on the same side of the great question, and later tradition came to honor them together as the two pillars of the early church. Despite their sharp differences in temperament and their occasional clashes, they were very different men. Paul was a scholar, trained in the law, fierce in argument, restless and brilliant. Peter was a fisherman, plain-spoken, warm, impulsive, more shepherd than scholar. The movement needed both, the thinker who could explain the message to the wider world, and the fisherman who anchored it in the memory of the man they had all followed. By now Peter was no longer the young man who had left his nets on the beach. Years had passed. He had buried friends, faced councils and prisons, travelled far from the little lake where he began, and helped steer the movement through the crisis that would determine its entire future. He had become, in the eyes of the growing community, a figure of enormous authority, the first among the leaders, the one whose name carried a special weight. And yet he remained recognizably himself, the same man who reached too far and fell, who spoke before he thought, who loved fiercely and faltered under pressure. The boldness and the weakness had never been separated. They were two sides of the same large heart. His work in the lands he knew was drawing toward its close. The accounts and the traditions grow thinner here, and we lose the clear thread of his daily activities. But the strands that survive all point in one direction, toward the great city at the center of the world, the capital of the empire that ruled it all. Peter, the fisherman from Galilee, was making his way toward Rome. He was traveling into the heart of the power that had crucified his master, into a city ruled by an emperor whose name would become a byword for cruelty. The last chapter of his life was about to be written there, far from the lake, in the shadow of the empire, and it would end in a way that turned his greatest failure into his greatest victory. The long road to Rome. The final stretch of Peter's life takes us away from the clear narrative of the early records and into the territory of tradition, where the threads grow thinner but all point in the same direction. The strongest and most ancient traditions hold that Peter, in his later years, made his way to Rome, the enormous capital at the center of the empire, and that he spent his last years there, leading the community of believers that had taken root in the very heart of the power that ruled the world. It was a fitting destination for the man who had been told to feed the whole flock. The flock now reached even into the imperial city, and the shepherd went to be with it. Rome in those years was the largest city in the world, a vast teeming place of perhaps 1 million people, crammed into a sprawl of marble temples and crowded tenements along the river. It was a city of staggering wealth and staggering poverty pressed up against each other. The great families lived in luxury that would have been unimaginable to a fisherman from Galilee, with their country estates, their hundreds of slaves, and their banquets that lasted for hours. But the bulk of the population lived in towering apartment blocks, several floors high, poorly built and prone to fire and collapse, packed together along narrow streets that never fell silent. Into this overwhelming city, with its noise and its danger and its sheer human density, came the aging fisherman, carrying the same message he had first preached in a Jerusalem street years before. The community of believers in Rome was small, a tiny seed in an enormous and indifferent city, and it lived quietly among the lower classes. The workers and the slaves and the poor, where the message had always found its warmest welcome. They met in private homes, shared their meals, cared for one another, and tried to live unnoticed in a city that worshipped a crowd of gods and revered the emperor himself as a divine figure. Their refusal to honor those gods, and their refusal to treat the emperor as divine, set them apart and made them objects of suspicion. They were rumored to be strange, antisocial, even dangerous, precisely because they would not join in the ordinary religious life of the city. Most of the time they were simply ignored, but the seeds of suspicion were there, waiting for a spark. The emperor in these years was a young man named Nero, who had come to the throne as a teenager, and who had, over time, developed into one of the most notorious rulers in all of history. He had begun his reign with some promise, guided by capable advisors, but as the years passed he had grown increasingly erratic, vain, and cruel. He fancied himself a great artist and performer, and he forced audiences to sit through his lengthy performances on stage, where it was said to be dangerous to leave early or appear insufficiently impressed. There are stories of people pretending to faint, or even pretending to die, simply to be carried out of the theatre and escape his singing. Whether or not every such tale is true, they capture the atmosphere of his court, a place where the ruler's vanity was a matter of life and death, and where flattery was the only safe response to almost anything. Into this reign, in the year 64, came a catastrophe that would change everything for the small community of believers. A great fire broke out in Rome and burned for days, sweeping through the crowded districts and destroying enormous portions of the city. Vast numbers of people were left homeless, and the suffering was immense. In the aftermath, a rumor began to spread that the emperor himself had started the fire, perhaps to clear ground for grand new building projects of his own, perhaps simply out of madness. Whether the rumor was true hardly mattered. What mattered was that Nero needed it to go away, and the surest way to deflect blame from himself was to find someone else to blame, a group already disliked and distrusted, who could be punished without anyone important objecting. The believers were the perfect target. They were already viewed with suspicion, already rumored to engage in strange practices, already set apart by their refusal to honor the gods of the city. So Nero blamed them for the fire, and he turned the full machinery of imperial cruelty against them. The persecution that followed was savage even by the standards of the time. Believers were rounded up and put to death in horrifying public spectacles, designed not merely to execute them but to entertain the crowds and to make an example of them. The accounts of these years that survive describe scenes of appalling cruelty conducted in the open as public entertainment. The little community that had lived quietly in the shadows was suddenly thrust into the glare of imperial fury. It was into this storm that the traditions placed the death of Peter, the aging fisherman who had begun his life pulling nets out of a quiet lake and had spent his final years leading the believers in the imperial capital, was caught up in Nero's persecution and condemned to die. The man who had once denied his master 3 times around a fire to save his own life now faced the ultimate version of that same test, in the cruelest city on earth, under one of the cruelest rulers in its history. But this time there would be no denial. The lesson of the courtyard had been learned long ago, on a charcoal fire on a Galilean shore, and Peter had spent the rest of his life proving that he had learnt it. We have followed Peter a long way to reach this point, from the empty net at dawn to the crowded streets of the world's greatest city. The boy who could not have imagined leaving Capernaum had crossed seas and entered palaces and stood before councils and emperors. The man who had been so easily frightened by a serving girl now waited, in a Roman prison, for an execution he would not try to escape. Every thread of his strange, uneven life was about to be drawn together into a single final act. The fisherman had become the rock, and the rock was about to be set permanently into the foundation of something that would outlast the empire that was about to kill him. The last morning was coming, and Peter was ready for it in a way that the young man on the lake could never have been. The cross turned upside down, the end of Peter's life, as the oldest traditions describe it, carried a final echo of the death that had set his whole story in motion. Peter was sentenced to die by crucifixion, the same brutal Roman execution that had killed his master decades before. It was the death the Romans reserved for slaves, rebels, and the lowest of the low, a slow and public agony designed to humiliate as much as to kill. For the man who had walked beside Jesus to Jerusalem and watched him die on a cross outside the city walls, the symmetry must have been almost unbearable, and at the same time, perhaps strangely fitting. He had spent his life following this man. Now he would follow him even in the manner of his death. But the most famous tradition about Peter's death adds a detail that has echoed through the centuries. According to that tradition, when Peter was brought to be crucified, he asked to be crucified upside down, with his head toward the ground, because he did not consider himself worthy to die in exactly the same way as his master. It was, in its way, the final expression of everything Peter had become. The man who had once boasted that he would never abandon Jesus, who had insisted he was ready for prison and death, and who had then denied his master 3 times before dawn, now, at the very end, would not even claim the dignity of dying in the same posture as the one he had failed. The boastful pride of the upper room had been completely burned away, and what remained was humility. We should be honest that we cannot verify every detail of this final scene. The records grow thin, and tradition fills the gaps. But the central facts are widely accepted by historians, that Peter went to Rome, that he led the community there, and that he died as a martyr during the persecution under Nero, sometime in the middle of the 60s. The specific image of the inverted cross comes from later tradition, but it captures something true about the man as the earlier records present him. Whatever the precise details of his death, Peter died refusing to deny the one he had once denied, and that refusal, more than any miracle or sermon, completed the long arc of his life. The place where Peter was buried became, over time, one of the most significant sites in the world. The early believers in Rome remembered where their leader had died and been laid to rest, on a hill outside the city, and they treated the spot as sacred. Centuries later, after the empire that had killed Peter had itself adopted his faith, a great church was built over that very location. And centuries after that, the enormous basilica that stands there today was raised on the same spot in the place that bears his name. Beneath its floor, archaeologists in modern times uncovered an ancient burial site that many believe to be the grave of the fisherman himself. The man who began his life hauling empty nets out of a small lake now lies, according to that long tradition, beneath one of the largest churches on earth, in the heart of the city that once put him to death. The consequences of Peter's life are almost impossible to measure because they unfolded over so many centuries and touched so much of the world. The small movement he helped to lead, which began with a handful of frightened Galileans hiding behind locked doors, grew steadily through the very persecutions that were meant to destroy it. The blood of those who died, like Peter, seemed only to convince others of the depth of their conviction. Within a few centuries, the faith that Peter had carried from a Jerusalem street to a Roman prison had spread across the entire empire, and eventually the empire itself adopted it. The fisherman had outlasted the emperor. Nero's name became a symbol of cruelty and madness. Peter's name was given to the greatest church in the capital of his former enemy. The community that Peter led in Rome came to occupy a special place in the imagination of the wider church. Because Peter had been singled out by Jesus, named the rock, given the keys, and because tradition held that he had led and died in Rome, the leaders of the Roman community came to be seen, over the following centuries, as his successors, inheriting a special authority that traced back to him. From this grew the institution of the papacy, the line of bishops of Rome who would come to be called popes, each one regarded by a large portion of the Christian world as standing in Peter's place. The title that later generations would give to Peter himself, the first pope, was applied looking backward. but the chain that the institution claimed ran all the way to that fisherman from Capernaum. Few men in history have cast a longer shadow forward in time, and almost none of them began from a place so humble. What endures most, though, is not the institution but the man. Peter has remained, across 2,000 years, one of the most beloved figures in the Christian story, and the reason is not his perfection but his humanity. People have loved Peter precisely because he failed and was forgiven, because he reached too far and fell, because he spoke before he thought, and made promises he could not keep and wept bitterly when he broke them. In a story full of saints and martyrs, he is the one who is most like the rest of us, the one who got things wrong, the one who needed to be picked up off the water and forgiven by a fire, and given a second chance he did not deserve. The decision to build a movement on a man like that, rather than on someone flawless, has comforted countless people who knew their own failures all too well. And so we come to the end of the long road that began at dawn on a quiet lake. We started with a tired fisherman pulling up an empty net, a man with no idea that his life was about to be turned inside out. We followed him through the call on the beach, the years on the road, the height of his confession and the depth of his denial, the morning of his forgiveness, the day the movement began, the prisons and the councils and the long journey to Rome. We leave him now beneath a great church in a city that has forgotten the emperor who killed him, but remembers every single day the fisherman's name. He was an ordinary man who said yes to something extraordinary, who failed at it badly, and who was given the chance to try again and again until the trying became the truest thing about him. That, in the end, is why his story has lasted, not because he was a rock from the beginning, but because he became one. Well, our journey has come to its quiet end, and the long road from the lake to the city is behind us now. There is nothing left to do but let it all settle. Let your breathing slow and your thoughts grow soft, and let the names and the places drift gently out of focus, the way the lights of a far shore fade as a boat moves out into calm water. If you are still awake out there, there is another story waiting for you on the screen whenever you are ready, a new journey to drift into on another quiet night. And if you enjoyed this one, feel free to like and subscribe, or to leave a thought down in the comments below where so many other sleepless travelers have gathered. But for now, there is nothing more you need to do. Relax your body, let your eyes close, and let yourself sink into rest. Good night, and sweet dreams.